If you vote to erase an entire species before it has committed a single crime today, then the crime belongs to you. The words did not come from a general, or an admiral, or even the leader of Earth. They came from an elderly woman seated high above the chamber, and for the first time in generations, the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council fell completely silent. No translator buzzed. No delegate whispered. Thousands of eyes shifted toward the center of the circular floor, where Ambassador Nathan Brooks quietly adjusted the cuff of his charcoal gray suit, as though he had just walked into another long committee meeting instead of the most important trial in human history. Outside the towering crystal walls, the endless traffic of diplomatic vessels continued to drift across the stars, unaware that a single vote inside this room could decide whether billions of people would wake up tomorrow under the same sun they had always called home. Nathan placed his worn leather briefcase beside his chair and slowly looked around the chamber. Every seat was occupied. Representatives from 37 civilizations had traveled across the galaxy for this emergency session. Some refused to look him in the eye. Others watched him with open contempt. A few simply looked nervous, as though they wished they were anywhere else. At the highest platform, Council Chancellor Varys leaned forward, his calm expression revealing nothing. This emergency assembly is now in session. The proposal before the Council is Resolution 794. Authorization for the permanent eradication of the Terran civilization based on projected existential threat. No one gasped. The words had been circulating through private channels for weeks. They only sounded heavier now because they had become official. Nathan folded his hands together on the polished table. Across the room, one delegate from the Kalair Dominion stood first. Humanity adapts too quickly. Another followed. They weaponize every technology they discover. A third added. They ignore historical patterns. They survive conditions that should eliminate developing civilizations. One after another, representatives listed reasons why humanity made them uncomfortable. They did not accuse Earth of invading worlds. They did not accuse humans of breaking treaties. They feared something less tangible. Potential. Nathan listened without interrupting. His face never changed. He simply reached into his jacket, removed a small black notebook, and wrote a single line with a fountain pen. The scratching of ink across paper echoed louder than anyone expected. Chancellor Varys finally turned toward him. Ambassador Brooks, before voting begins, you are entitled to one statement in defense of your people. Every camera in the chamber rotated toward the lone human. Billions across the galaxy waited for anger, desperation, bargaining, or outrage. Nathan looked down at the notebook for another moment before gently closing it. He stood, straightened his jacket, and met the Chancellor's eyes with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his entire life solving impossible meetings one conversation at a time. "Thank you, Chancellor," he said in a voice so calm it almost sounded friendly. "I won't be making a defense." The room froze. Several delegates exchanged confused looks. One reporter actually lowered her recording device. Chancellor Varys blinked once. "You decline your opportunity?" Nathan nodded. "Yes. Do you understand what this vote represents?" "Perfectly. Then why aren't you asking this council to spare humanity?" Nathan allowed the smallest hint of a tired smile to appear. "Because if any civilization in this room still needs convincing after everything history has already shown you, then nothing I say today will change your minds." The silence that followed felt different now. It was no longer the silence of confidence. It was the silence that appears when people suddenly realize someone else may know something they do not. Counselor Selene of the Arcturian Compact was the first to break the silence. She leaned forward, resting both hands on the polished railing in front of her. "Then perhaps history should remind everyone why we are here." A soft wave of approval rippled through the chamber. Chancellor Varys gave a slight nod. "Proceed." The enormous display suspended above the council floor flickered to life. One by one, images and reports filled the air. Freight stations built by human engineers on worlds where no other species could survive. Medical breakthroughs that had spread across dozens of civilizations within a single decade. Terraforming projects completed in half the predicted time. Every accomplishment was followed by another statistic. Human population growth, industrial output, scientific adaptation, expedition range, resource efficiency. Every cycle, Selene said, they become stronger. Every crisis becomes another lesson. Every setback becomes another advantage. We have studied thousands of civilizations. None adapt like humans. Another delegate stood. Governor Marcus Hale of the Orion Trade League, a human ally until political pressure forced him to distance himself from Earth. He looked uncomfortable before speaking. The concern is not what humanity has done. It is what humanity will eventually be capable of doing. Nathan remained standing without saying a word. The projector shifted again. Historical projections appeared beside current data. Curves climbed steadily upward. Human ship production, artificial gravity research, deep space exploration, cross-species manufacturing partnerships. Every line pointed in the same direction. Up. Counselor Derek from the vast Dominion folded his forearms across his chest. Our military analysts estimate that within 40 years Earth will no longer require any strategic alliance. Within 70 years, they will possess enough industrial capacity to challenge every major fleet combined. Several delegates quietly agreed. Others avoided looking toward the human ambassador altogether. Nathan simply reached into his briefcase, removed a pair of reading glasses, and calmly reviewed a printed agenda, as though none of this involved his own civilization. A young delegate seated near the outer circle whispered to her colleague, "Why is he reading meeting notes?" Her colleague answered just as quietly, "I do not think he is distracted. I think he is waiting." Chancellor Varys noticed it too. "Ambassador Brooks." Nathan looked up politely. "Yes, Chancellor? Do these projections concern you?" Nathan considered the question for a moment. "No." The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Varys narrowed his eyes. "You are saying your own government's expansion does not concern you?" Nathan smiled faintly. "Expansion is not the same thing as conquest." Before anyone could respond, another delegate interrupted. "That distinction only matters until someone has enough power to ignore it." Murmurs spread around the chamber again. Counselor Celine activated another report. This one carried an orange security seal. "Over the last 20 years, she continued, human engineers have repeatedly solved problems declared impossible by every major research institute in this council. They reverse engineer foreign technology faster than predicted. They redesign equipment for environments that destroy everyone else's machinery. They recover from disasters that should permanently cripple developing civilizations." She paused before adding quietly, "That is exactly why they frighten us." Nathan listened carefully, then slowly closed the agenda in front of him. "May I ask one question?" Varys hesitated before nodding. "One question." Nathan looked around the massive chamber, meeting the eyes of delegate after delegate. "Everything you have described today," he said evenly, "was accomplished while humanity believed cooperation was the future. Has anyone stopped to ask what might happen if one day we stopped believing that?" No one answered. The silence returned once more, but this time it carried something different. Until that moment, every delegate had spoken as though humanity itself was the danger. Nathan's question quietly shifted the focus. Perhaps the real danger was not what humans had become. Perhaps it was what could happen if the galaxy gave them a reason to become something else. The chamber remained so quiet that Nathan could hear the faint hum of the environmental systems hidden behind the towering walls. It reminded him of old government buildings back on Earth where every important decision somehow sounded louder because nobody dared raise their voice. Chancellor Varys rested both hands on the stone podium. "Very well," he said. "If the ambassador refuses to defend his people, the council will proceed with formal testimony." One by one, representatives activated their microphones. Counselor Derek stood first. "For 3 centuries, the council has maintained peace by preventing any one civilization from growing beyond reasonable balance. Humanity has exceeded every projection placed before this body. That alone demands action." Another delegate followed immediately. "Earth develops solutions faster than we can regulate them." A third representative added, "Their scientists share discoveries freely until someone attempts to restrict them. Then they quietly continue somewhere else." Light laughter spread across several rows. Nathan almost smiled. They had unknowingly described one of humanity's oldest habits. Solve the problem first. Ask permission later if necessary. Chancellor Varys looked toward the human ambassador once again. "Do you dispute any of these observations?" Nathan slowly removed his reading glasses and folded them carefully before answering. "No." The answer startled several delegates. One reporter actually frowned in confusion while checking her notes. "You agree?" Varys asked. "Of course," Nathan replied. Humans adapt quickly. We always have. Then why should this council not act before your civilization becomes unstoppable? Nathan glanced upward toward the massive ceiling where countless small lights reflected like distant stars. Because you are asking the wrong question. Varys leaned forward. Then tell us the right one. Nathan took a slow breath before speaking. Ask why we adapt. Several members exchanged puzzled looks. Counselor Celine crossed her arms. Survival. Nathan nodded politely. Exactly. He walked a few measured steps across the center platform. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice. Just the relaxed pace of someone explaining an ordinary fact. Earth never had the luxury of assuming tomorrow would be easier than today. Hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, disease, economic collapse, political disagreements, resource shortages. Every generation inherited problems the previous one failed to solve. We learned very early that waiting for perfect conditions usually meant waiting forever. Nobody interrupted him. You see ambition, Nathan continued. We see habit. A delegate from the outer colonies spoke up. Habit does not explain your military projections. Nathan looked toward him with a friendly expression. No, it explains something far more important. The delegate tilted his head. Nathan continued. You assume every improvement is part of some master plan to dominate the galaxy. Most of the time we are simply trying to fix yesterday's mistake before tomorrow arrives. Several delegates quietly looked back at the reports floating above the chamber. For the first time, the numbers seemed to tell a different story. Chancellor Varys noticed the shift immediately. Ambassador Brooks, he said carefully. Are you suggesting this council has misunderstood humanity from the beginning? Nathan did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into his worn briefcase once more. This time he removed a faded family photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. It showed 3 generations standing together outside a modest house somewhere on Earth beneath a bright summer sky. He looked at it for only a second before placing it gently on the table. Every civilization believes it knows another species after reading enough reports, he said quietly. Statistics are comfortable. Charts are predictable. Families are not. A few delegates leaned forward, curious despite themselves. Nathan rested one hand beside the photograph. Everything you have shown today measures what humanity can build. None of it measures what humanity refuses to become. Those words lingered over the chamber long after he stopped speaking. Even the delegates who still intended to support the resolution found themselves hesitating, because for the first time since the emergency session had begun, they realized there might be an entire part of human history that none of their intelligence reports had ever truly understood. I have learned that the most dangerous secrets are never destroyed. They are simply filed where decent people stop looking. The unexpected voice came from the upper gallery reserved for historical advisors. An elderly delegate named Miriam Cross slowly rose to her feet. She was human by birth, but she had served the council archives for almost 40 years and had earned the respect of nearly every civilization in the chamber. Her silver hair framed a calm face that had seen far too many classified records. Chancellor, she said evenly, before this council proceeds with a vote that cannot be reversed, I respectfully request access to Archive Classification Black 7. The chamber immediately stirred. Councillor Derrick frowned. That archive has been sealed for over 300 years. Correct, Miriam replied. Which is exactly why it should be reviewed. Chancellor Varys remained silent for several seconds. State your reason. Miriam folded her hands behind her back. Because every delegate in this room keeps speaking about humanity's future while ignoring a chapter of our shared past. A young representative from the Western Spiral sectors looked genuinely confused. There has never been a major conflict involving Earth before council membership. Miriam slowly turned toward him. That is what your textbooks say. More whispers spread through the chamber. Nathan Brooks did not react. He simply looked toward Miriam with the expression of someone recognizing an old friend after many years apart. Chancellor Varys noticed the exchange immediately. Ambassador Brooks, were you aware of this archive? Nathan answered honestly. Yes. Why did you not mention it? Nathan smiled faintly. Because nobody asked. Several frustrated voices echoed through the chamber. Counselor Celine raised her hand for order. What exactly is stored in Black 7? Miriam looked toward the enormous ceiling before answering. Records from the first expansion crisis. Original witness statements. Military correspondence. Diplomatic transcripts. Material sealed by unanimous council decision. Derek shook his head. Those files were sealed because they no longer served any practical purpose. Miriam met his eyes without hesitation. Or because they became inconvenient. The room fell quiet again. Chancellor Varys finally reached beneath his podium and placed his palm against a secure biometric panel. A soft chime echoed throughout the chamber. High above them, the enormous holographic display faded to black. Bright silver letters appeared across its surface. Archive Black 7. Restricted access. Authorization required. Several delegates shifted uneasily in their seats. Even those who had spent decades inside the council had never seen the archive activated. The system requested confirmation from the Chancellor. Varys hesitated. Archive intelligence, he said clearly. State reason for historical restriction. The artificial voice answered immediately. Historical restriction established to preserve interstellar stability following unanimous emergency resolution. A few delegates exchanged uncertain looks. The wording sounded strangely careful. Chancellor Varys continued. State the nature of the archived event. There was a pause lasting only 2 seconds, but it felt much longer. Request exceeds automatic disclosure authority. That answer caused visible surprise across the chamber. Council archives had never refused a direct question from the Chancellor. Varys frowned. Override requested. Override denied. The chamber erupted into confused conversations. Nathan quietly remained where he was, his hands resting comfortably on the table. He looked less surprised than anyone else. Councillor Selene stared toward the glowing display. Denied? By whose authority? The archive answered in the same calm mechanical voice. Original classification established under Founding Emergency Provision 12. Access requires approval from surviving signatory civilizations. A clerk hurriedly reviewed the historical registry before looking up with disbelief. Chancellor, there were only 7 signatories. Varys nodded impatiently. I know our own history. The clerk swallowed. Only one of those civilizations still exists. Every eye in the chamber slowly turned toward Nathan Brooks. He did not move. He simply folded his hands together once again as though the room had finally reached the part of the meeting he had been patiently waiting for all along. Chancellor Varys slowly exhaled as the weight of the moment settled over the chamber. Ambassador Brooks, he said, his voice lower than before. Are you telling this council that humanity is the last surviving signatory to one of our founding emergency provisions? Nathan nodded once. Yes. No pride. No satisfaction. Just a simple acknowledgement of fact. The Chancellor glanced toward the historical advisors. Why has no sitting council been informed of this? Miriam Cross answered before anyone else could. Because the archive was sealed before any current delegate was born. Each generation inherited the restriction without inheriting the reason. The words landed heavily. Councillor Selene looked back at the suspended display. Then open what you can. The archive responded with another soft tone. Partial historical summary authorized. The dark screen brightened, revealing an old star map. It looked primitive compared to modern navigation systems, with faded routes and outdated territorial markers. Several delegates leaned forward as unfamiliar names appeared across worlds that no longer existed. 312 standard years ago, the archive began. Multiple expansion powers entered simultaneous territorial conflict beyond the Perseus corridor. Initial projections estimated a regional crisis lasting fewer than 18 months. Another map replaced the first. Colored borders expanded, shifted, then disappeared altogether. Projection failed. The chamber remained silent. As trade routes collapsed, refugee traffic exceeded logistical capacity. Coalition governments requested emergency assistance from every known spacefaring civilization. Nathan quietly watched the display without speaking. He had memorized these records years ago. For everyone else, the story was completely new. The archive continued. At the time, humanity possessed neither the largest fleet nor the strongest economy. Earth was classified as a developing interstellar member with limited political influence. Councillor Derek frowned. That matches the official history. Correction, the archive replied. Official history incomplete. More maps appeared. One after another, failing supply lines turned red. Agricultural shortages spread across neighboring sectors. Civilian evacuation routes vanished from the display. Analysis concluded that no participating civilization possessed sufficient logistical capability to stabilize all affected regions simultaneously. Nathan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered his grandfather telling him stories about those years, not as military victories, but as endless weeks of cargo schedules, exhausted crews, and impossible decisions. The archive spoke again. Earth proposed Operation Harbor Light. Several delegates exchanged puzzled looks. None recognized the name. Miriam Cross quietly smiled to herself. Of course they erased that name, she whispered. A younger delegate asked, what was Operation Harbor Light? Before the archive answered, Nathan finally spoke. It was never a military operation. Every face turned toward him. It was a promise. The room grew still once more. The archive confirmed his statement. Operation Harbor Light committed all available Terran industrial capacity to humanitarian transport, food production, emergency medical manufacturing, and civilian evacuation support regardless of political alignment. Counselor Celine blinked in surprise. Regardless of political alignment. Confirmed. Another image appeared. Hundreds of old Terran cargo vessels filled the display. None looked elegant. None looked intimidating. They were practical ships covered with repair patches, mismatched hull plates, and faded registry numbers. Nathan quietly smiled as he recognized several famous names from human history. Those were not warships, he said softly. Most of them were farmers, mechanics, long-haul freight crews, volunteer pilots, and retired Coast Guard captains who simply refused to leave people behind. The chamber remained fixed on the aging fleet displayed above them. Until now, every conversation had focused on humanity's potential to become dangerous. For the first time, the Council was looking at evidence of something far less predictable, a civilization that had once chosen responsibility over advantage when no law required it, and no one had even bothered to remember. Ironically, the archive never praised humanity. It simply continued listing numbers, dates, cargo logs, and rescue records with the same emotionless voice it had used since the Council first sealed the files. Somehow, that made every word even harder to ignore. Operation Harbor Light remained active for 6 years, 4 months, and 19 days, the system announced. Terran civilian vessels completed more than 800,000 relief missions across 112 inhabited systems. The display filled with old registry photographs, rust-colored freighters, heavy cargo haulers, hospital transports, ice mining ships converted into supply carriers. None of them looked impressive. They looked like working machines that had stayed in service far longer than anyone expected. Nathan quietly recognized one registration number. He smiled to himself. My grandfather served on that ship, he said. A few delegates turned toward him. He was not a soldier. He repaired refrigeration units. Nobody laughed. Nathan continued in the same calm voice. He used to tell me they spent weeks delivering insulin, clean water systems, and replacement generators. They never knew who would need help next. They just kept moving. The archive confirmed his memory. 92% of Terran personnel assigned to Harbor Light served in civilian occupations before deployment. Counselor Celine looked genuinely confused. Why commit your civilian workforce during a regional collapse? Nathan answered without hesitation. Because there were not enough professionals. He shrugged slightly. When your neighbor's house is on fire, you do not wait until someone earns the official title of firefighter. You grab a hose. The simplicity of the answer lingered over the chamber. Another series of documents appeared. These were not cargo manifests. They were diplomatic requests. Hundreds of them. One after another. Emergency appeals sent from governments that no longer existed. Chancellor Vares quietly read the names. Most of these governments later voted against Earth joining the Council. They did, Nathan replied. Did humanity know that would happen? Probably. Then why help them? Nathan looked surprised by the question. Because hungry children do not vote on foreign policy. The chamber became still once again. Miriam Cross lowered her eyes for a moment. Even after decades studying the archive, hearing those words spoken aloud carried a different weight. The archive resumed. During the final year of the crisis, multiple coalition fleets regained operational readiness. Strategic advisors recommended that Terran leadership secure abandoned territories as compensation for sustained logistical losses. Counselor Derek looked up immediately. Finally, something that makes sense. The archive paused. Recommendation declined. Derek frowned. Decline. Confirmed. Terran Executive Council unanimously rejected territorial expansion. More documents appeared. Signed resolutions. Recorded debates. Budget reports. None of them mentioned conquest. Every page focused on rebuilding damaged trade routes and returning local governments to self-sufficiency. Nathan gently rested his fingertips on the edge of the table. "We went home," he said quietly. "That was the plan from the beginning." A younger delegate spoke almost to herself. "You could have become the dominant power." Nathan nodded. "Maybe. But you walked away." "Yes." She stared at him, unable to understand. "Why?" Nathan thought about the question longer than any previous one. His answer came softly, almost like he was remembering a conversation from many years ago. Because power gained from someone else's worst day never feels like something worth celebrating. Nobody responded. Even Counselor Derek looked down at the reports instead of arguing. The numbers on the screen had not changed. The history had not changed. Only the people reading it had. For the first time since the emergency session began, several delegates no longer looked at humanity as an ambitious civilization climbing toward dominance. They began to wonder whether the greatest mystery about Earth had never been how strong humans could become, but why they had repeatedly chosen to stop when no one else would have. Counselor Derek slowly stood again, but this time the confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. He looked toward Chancellor Varys before speaking. "The archive proves humanity acted honorably during the first expansion crisis. I accept that, but honorable civilizations change. 3 centuries is a long time." Several delegates nodded in quiet agreement. Nathan did not interrupt. It was a fair question. Chancellor Varys folded his hands. "The Council recognizes the concern. Historical virtue alone cannot determine present policy." Nathan smiled slightly. "I agree." That answer caught everyone off guard once again. Derek narrowed his eyes. "You agree?" "Of course," Nathan replied. "Good people can make terrible decisions. History should never become an excuse to stop asking difficult questions." For the first time, Derek found himself uncertain how to argue with the human ambassador. Nathan had calmly agreed with nearly every criticism presented against his own civilization. It was an approach none of them understood. Miriam Cross quietly stepped toward the center console. "There is one final testimony attached to Black 7. Chancellor Varys looked at her. "Another report?" "No." She paused. "A witness." The chamber immediately fell silent. Miriam activated a small crystal data module that had remained hidden beneath the archive controls. A recording appeared above the council floor. The image quality was old, slightly faded by time, but the figure standing behind the podium was unmistakable. An elderly alien wearing the ceremonial robes of a founding council elder looked directly into the camera. His voice carried the rough exhaustion of someone who had already lived through too much. "If this message is being viewed," he began, "then everyone who stood beside me is almost certainly gone." The delegates watched without moving. "My name is Elder Kalen. I record this statement not for my generation, but for yours. We survived the first expansion crisis because one civilization repeatedly chose restraint when every strategic calculation rewarded conquest." The recording shifted to old images of exhausted cargo crews unloading supplies beside families from dozens of different species. There were no victory parades, no military banners, just ordinary people handing boxes to strangers. Kalen continued, "Many among us feared that humanity would eventually dominate the galaxy. We were wrong about the reason they frightened us." Nathan lowered his eyes. He had heard this recording only once before. "Human strength was never the greatest danger," Kalen said. "Human restraint was." Confused murmurs spread across the chamber. The old elder continued before anyone could speak. "A civilization capable of enormous power, but choosing mercy teaches every other civilization an uncomfortable truth. It reveals how often the rest of us mistake opportunity for justification." Nobody moved. Nobody even looked away from the recording. Kalen's tired expression softened. "We sealed these records because we believed future generations might become dependent upon humanity's example instead of developing their own moral courage. Looking back now, I am no longer certain that decision was wise." The recording ended with several seconds of silence before fading into darkness. No music followed. No dramatic conclusion. Just the quiet hum of the archive returning to standby mode. Counselor Celine slowly sat down without saying a word. Derek stared at the empty display as though trying to reconcile everything he had believed only an hour earlier. Chancellor Varys finally broke the silence. Ambassador Brooks. Nathan looked up. Yes, Chancellor? Varys studied him carefully before asking. Did humanity know these recordings still existed? Nathan answered honestly. Yes. Then why did your government never reveal them? Nathan looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who no longer seemed quite as certain as before. His answer came quietly. Because respect that has to be demanded is not respect. It is marketing. We believed the truth would matter only if the galaxy chose to find it on its own. No one argued with him. Not because they suddenly agreed with humanity, but because they had begun asking themselves a far more unsettling question. If a civilization had carried that burden of restraint for centuries without asking for recognition, what else had the council failed to understand about the people they were preparing to judge? The chamber clock reached the final hour allocated for debate. According to council procedure, discussion had ended. What remained was simple. Every representative would cast one vote, and the decision would become binding across known space. Chancellor Varys slowly rose from his seat. The confidence he had carried into the session had been replaced by something far more cautious. Delegates, he said, the historical archive has been entered into the official record. We now proceed under Article 9. Final vote authorization. Soft lights illuminated every voting console throughout the circular chamber. One by one, symbols appeared above each desk, waiting for confirmation. Nathan Brooks remained standing beside his chair, his briefcase still resting on the polished floor exactly where he had placed it hours earlier. He did not look toward the voting panels. Instead, he quietly watched the delegates themselves. Some stared at their screens. Others looked toward one another, searching for reassurance that no longer seemed to exist. Counselor Celine rested her hand above the confirmation pad, but did not press it. Derek sat perfectly still, reading the archive summary for what must have been the 5th time. Even the reporters in the upper gallery had stopped whispering. It felt less like a political session and more like a room full of people realizing they had almost signed something they did not fully understand. Chancellor Varys activated the tally system. Delegates may now record their decisions. A soft tone echoed through the chamber. One green light appeared, then another. Several votes registered in favor of the resolution. The display quietly updated each total. Nathan never moved. More lights followed. Then the pace slowed. Entire rows remained undecided. Counselor Celine finally looked up instead of down. Ambassador Brooks, she said, may I ask one personal question? Nathan nodded. Of course. If the vote passes today, what will Earth do? Every eye in the chamber shifted toward the lone human once again. Nathan thought about the question carefully. We will go home. A few delegates looked confused. Celine continued. And then? Nathan answered with the same calm voice he had used all day. Then our elected leaders will decide how to protect our people. Nobody mistook his meaning for a threat. It sounded more like the answer any nation would give when facing an existential crisis. Somehow, that made it even more unsettling. Derek quietly asked, would humanity forgive us? Nathan smiled sadly. Forgiveness belongs to individuals. I represent a government, not every heart on Earth. The honesty of the answer settled over the room like a heavy fog. No promises, no dramatic warnings, just reality. Chancellor Varys looked toward the growing vote count. Enough approvals had already been entered that the resolution could still pass. All it needed was the remaining undecided delegates. Before he could announce the next step, a sharp notification interrupted the chamber. It was not an alarm. It was the archive itself. The silver display lit up one final time. Founding Emergency Provision 12, the artificial voice announced. Historical advisory automatically triggered. Every delegate looked upward. Advisory statement. Civilizations considering irreversible action against a restraint-based species must evaluate one additional variable. Chancellor Varys frowned. State the variable. The archive answered without hesitation. Probability that the targeted civilization has exercised restraint beyond recorded observation. Silence followed. The sentence was painfully simple. Yet every delegate immediately understood its implication. Everything revealed today represented only the history humanity had chosen to preserve. None of them could honestly say they knew where the limits of that restraint truly ended. Counselor Celine slowly withdrew her hand from the voting console. Across the chamber, another delegate did the same. Then another. Nathan quietly watched the movement spread from one row to the next, saying nothing at all. He had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest argument was allowing people enough silence to hear their own conscience. The voting display remained suspended above the chamber, but no new lights appeared. Seconds stretched into minutes. For the first time since the Galactic Council had been founded, the greatest obstacle to a decision was not disagreement. It was hesitation. Chancellor Varys slowly looked around the room before speaking. Delegates, under council law, abstentions are permitted. However, this resolution cannot proceed without the required majority. No one reached for a voting console. Counselor Celine quietly stood. I withdraw my support. Another delegate followed. The vast Dominion changes its vote to abstain pending full historical review. Across the chamber, more voices joined them. Some requested additional investigation. Others admitted the council had judged humanity without understanding the whole story. The vote did not collapse because anyone suddenly believed humans were harmless. It collapsed because certainty had disappeared. Chancellor Varys watched the numbers change until the outcome became undeniable. He slowly deactivated the voting system. Resolution 794 is hereby suspended indefinitely. No applause followed. No celebration echoed through the chamber. The decision felt too heavy for triumph. Nathan Brooks quietly bent down, picked up his old leather briefcase, and buttoned his jacket. He thanked the Chancellor with a respectful nod, then started walking toward the exit at the same steady pace he had entered with hours earlier. Ambassador Brooks, Varys called after him. Nathan stopped and turned. Yes, Chancellor? The Chancellor hesitated before asking the question that had quietly followed him throughout the entire session. Tell me honestly, had the resolution passed today, would humanity have survived? Nathan looked at him for several long seconds. His expression carried neither pride nor resentment, only the calm exhaustion of someone who had answered difficult questions for most of his life. I do not know, he replied. Several delegates looked surprised. Nathan continued before anyone could misunderstand. Because survival is never guaranteed. Not for humans. Not for anyone. He glanced around the chamber one last time. What I do know is that fear has a habit of making good people believe they have no choice. History usually proves otherwise. Nobody spoke. Nathan smiled politely. I hope the next generation remembers that better than ours did. With that, he walked through the enormous chamber doors. They closed behind him with a quiet sound that somehow carried farther than any speech delivered that day. Weeks later, the council issued a new directive. Every civilization seeking action against another member would first be required to review the complete historical record between them before proposing irreversible measures. It became known informally as the Brooks Standard. Not because humanity had demanded recognition, but because one calm conversation had reminded an entire galaxy that memory is a form of responsibility. Years later, young students from dozens of worlds would visit the restored Hall of Archives. They would stand beneath the old display where the famous vote had quietly unraveled and ask their teachers the same question. Why was humanity never erased when everyone seemed so afraid of them? The answer was always remarkably simple. Because someone finally remembered that strength is easy to fear, but restraint is much harder to understand. And perhaps that was the lesson worth carrying beyond Earth, beyond the Council, and beyond the stars themselves. A civilization is not measured by how much power it can gather. It is measured by what it chooses not to do when it has every opportunity to do otherwise. Long after names fade, governments change, and monuments crumble into dust, that choice is what history remembers. And it is often the quiet decisions, made by ordinary people who refuse to surrender their conscience to fear, that end up protecting the future for everyone.